What does C.S. Lewis have to say about how we come to know things? And how does this speak into the algorithmic world in which we inhabit so often today? I'd love to have a look at his Meditation in a Toolshed article, which is often but not always published in his book God in the Dock, or you can just look it up on Google and see it as a PDF format there as well. In it, Lewis describes standing in a dark toolshed, and there's a beam of light coming in through a crack in the door that he's looking at. And when he's looking at this beam of light, that is all he can see. It is all encompassing, and everything else is dark around this one beam of light coming in through the door. But then he changes his perspective and he looks along the beam. And suddenly he doesn't actually see the beam itself anymore because he's seeing by it. He actually sees through the crack in the door to the outside where there's a lovely sunny day and he can see the leaves on a tree. He uses this to talk about the difference between looking at a thing and looking along a thing. He goes further and uses the age-old analogy, boy meets girl. And he says how in love, the couple are experiencing love in a looking along way. They are inhabiting love. But a scientist might come along and say, well, these are the different things that are firing in their brains when they experience their infatuation for their love for one another. He goes on to talk about how a mathematician might have a thought in his brain that he's going through when he's thinking about a sum. And again, a scientist would come and say, well, that's this part of his brain working in order to achieve this outcome. And Lewis says that for the past few years, obviously he was writing himself quite a few years ago now, but the looking at way of seeing the world had been given priority over the looking along. He uses more examples like going to anthropologists to understand religion rather than to religious people, or going to psychologists to understand love rather than to lovers. And he says that we need to take stock and ask ourselves, is this really the best form of knowing? It's not that he's saying that it's wrong to look at something and to take a step back, look at an idea or a concept or a thing under a microscope and really analyze it, but that this is a pause from the way in which life is usually lived. He says this later in the article. It has even come to be taken for granted that the external account of a thing, so this would be the looking at way of seeing things, somehow refutes or debunks the account given from inside. How many times on this internet algorithmic world that we live in have we seen so-and-so debunks so-and-so? And then you get the debunking, the debunker video that comes out a bit later, and the cycle goes on and on. And we should ask ourselves, how often does this actually result in coming to know a thing, and what kind of knowledge are we seeking from it? Lewis goes on to say this further down. It is perfectly easy to go on all your life giving explanations of religion, love, morality, honour and the like without having been inside any of them. And if you do that, you are simply playing with counters. You go on explaining a thing without knowing what it is. That is why a great deal of contemporary thought is, strictly speaking, thought about nothing. All the apparatus of thought busily working in a vacuum. And I think that many of the things that we can see on social media sometimes is a bit like this thinking in a vacuum and one-upism and gaining points, and he talks about playing with counters. And so I think it's important to ask ourselves, where does that lead? And what would it look like if we looked along some of these ideas? Now, don't get me wrong, I am all for taking a step back, looking at our beliefs and values and holding them out and examining them. There is definitely a time and a place for that. Think of when you go to study at university, you choose a certain subject and you take time set aside out of your normal life in order to really go and research and potentially even become an expert in that subject. But the thing is though, when you go to do that, that is a diversion from normal everyday living. And even then, everyday life still continues whilst you're studying. I myself have been working the whole time that I've done my own academic study, which has meant that I've spread it out over a longer period of time. My first son was even born while I was writing my master's dissertation thesis. So we need to make sure that we understand that certain kinds of knowledge which involve looking at and examining something can only lead us so far. This is why I love the arts and literature. Let's think about the Chronicles of Narnia. It's written by the person we're talking about today, C.S. Lewis. What we get to experience in the Chronicles is inhabiting, stepping into and looking along a story. And a story by nature, we are always looking along something because it's a whole encompassing narrative that we are invited into. So we're not just looking at one thing in particular, we're looking along a whole plot line. And what we get to do is experience Lewis's understanding of the world as told through a story. And because it's a fantasy world that we are stepping into, we are allowed to do so without some of the constraints of the everyday world in which we live. But we emerge from that experience back into the everyday world, hopefully changed and with our perception enlightened in some way so that we can see the world around us with more depth, more value, and more meaning. So let's return to the toolshed to end this video and think about the fact that when you are looking at a beam of light in the toolshed, you can't see anything else from the outside world. You can only examine the thing that is there. But does that mean in your examining that there is no outside world? And if you decide to go and look along the beam, and remember we're using looking along to mean lived experience of the thing, then suddenly you can even see the outside world beyond the shed and even the cause of the beam itself.